If you are absolutely certain you have the right house, you will never notice the moment certainty becomes your greatest mistake. The digital clock beside the bed glowed 2:03 in pale blue numbers as the silence of the quiet Richmond neighborhood shattered without warning. A thunderous crash echoed through the small brick home, followed by urgent voices cutting through the darkness with practiced authority. Heavy footsteps crossed the hardwood floor, while powerful flashlights swept across framed family photographs, bookshelves, and carefully arranged furniture, turning familiar rooms into unfamiliar shadows. Vanessa Coleman opened her eyes instantly. Years of federal training had taught her to wake with a clear mind long before fear could cloud judgment. She sat upright on the edge of the bed for only a heartbeat, listening instead of reacting. Every sound mattered. Boots, radios, multiple voices. Someone called for another team to secure the back of the house. Someone else announced that every room needed to be cleared. Nothing about the voices suggested panic. They sounded disciplined, organized, and convinced they were exactly where they needed to be. Vanessa slowly stood, still wearing a simple gray sleep shirt and matching lounge pants. Her breathing remained steady as she reached toward the bedroom lamp, but stopped herself before touching it. Bright white beams from several tactical flashlights had already pierced the darkness beneath the bedroom door. She quietly raised both empty hands before taking a single step into the hallway. The old wooden floor felt cool beneath her bare feet. Family photographs lined the walls, illuminated one second and swallowed by darkness the next as moving lights crossed them. A picture of her late father in military uniform. Another of her mother smiling at a neighborhood cookout. A framed certificate from years ago, barely visible beneath dancing shadows. The peaceful home she had spent years creating suddenly felt like a place she no longer recognized. As she entered the living room, several police officers wearing dark uniforms stood frozen in carefully coordinated positions. Their flashlights illuminated every corner of the house while their eyes remained fixed on her. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped slightly forward, maintaining professional distance. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, his uniform immaculate despite the late hour, his expression focused and unwavering. His voice remained firm but controlled. "Ma'am, keep your hands where we can see them." Vanessa obeyed immediately, lifting both hands slightly higher without hesitation. She did not argue. She did not demand explanations. She simply looked from one officer to another, studying faces instead of uniforms. Years spent interviewing suspects, witnesses, and frightened victims had taught her that people often revealed more through their eyes than their words. Tonight she saw determination, fatigue, and something else that troubled her more than anything. Absolute certainty. Ryan glanced toward another officer who was already checking the hallway while a third quietly examined the kitchen entrance. Dispatch information replayed in his mind exactly as he had received it less than 15 minutes earlier. An armed suspect reportedly entered this residence after fleeing from nearby officers. Potential danger to occupants. Immediate response authorized. The address had been repeated twice over the radio. Every detail had sounded urgent. Every decision afterward had followed established procedure. Outside, patrol vehicles lined the narrow residential street, their emergency lights switched off to preserve visibility while only dim parking lamps reflected across rain-damp pavement. Curious neighbors watched discreetly through partially opened curtains without stepping outside into the cool spring air. A lonely porch light glowed across the street, casting long shadows over neatly trimmed lawns and parked cars. Inside the house, Ryan carefully observed the woman standing before him. She appeared remarkably calm for someone awakened by unexpected police activity. That composure unsettled him almost as much as the report that had brought his team there. Most people shouted. Some cried. Others demanded answers before listening to questions. She did none of those things. Instead, she spoke with quiet clarity. "Officer," she said gently, "before anyone goes any farther, would you please verify the address one more time?" Ryan kept his posture steady. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe a dangerous individual entered this residence." Vanessa slowly nodded. "Then I hope you find whoever you are looking for." Her answer caught him off guard. There was no sarcasm, no challenge, no visible fear, only an unusual confidence that seemed strangely out of place in the middle of a rapidly unfolding police operation. One younger officer glanced briefly toward Ryan as if silently asking whether something felt different about the situation. Ryan ignored the hesitation. Training demanded focus. Procedures existed for moments exactly like this. Yet as another flashlight swept across the living room wall, illuminating rows of books, neatly framed certificates, and carefully preserved memories before disappearing again into the darkness, an uneasy feeling settled quietly into the room, almost too small to notice but impossible to ignore. Only a few hours earlier, the same house had been wrapped in a completely different kind of silence. The evening sky above Richmond had glowed with deep shades of orange and violet as Vanessa Coleman slowly pulled her sedan into the driveway after an exhausting day that seemed to last far longer than the clock suggested. She remained seated behind the steering wheel for a moment before turning off the engine, allowing the quiet hum of the cooling vehicle to replace the constant conversations, telephones, and fluorescent lights that had filled her entire day. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the familiar scent of spring rain drifting through the slightly open window. Home had always been the one place where titles disappeared. Inside these walls, she was not someone expected to solve impossible problems. She was simply Vanessa. She unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and instinctively removed her shoes near the entrance before hanging her keys beside a small wooden shelf her father had built decades earlier. The living room reflected the life of someone who valued purpose over luxury. Books filled sturdy shelves from floor to ceiling. Framed photographs showed family reunions, neighborhood volunteer projects, and smiling children posing beside science fair displays. A neatly folded American flag rested inside a shadow box above the fireplace beside a photograph of her late father wearing his army uniform with unmistakable pride. Nothing in the home suggested wealth. Everything suggested discipline, service, and quiet gratitude. Vanessa carried a garment bag into the hallway and carefully unzipped it. Inside hung a dark blue FBI field jacket that still carried the faint scent of cool evening air from the memorial service she had attended only an hour earlier. She gently brushed away an invisible speck of dust before hanging it on a sturdy wall hook beside a framed certificate and an old photograph of her graduating class at Quantico. She paused there for a long moment, her fingertips resting lightly against the sleeve of the jacket. Earlier that afternoon, dozens of agents had gathered to honor a colleague who had given nearly 3 decades of service before losing his battle with cancer. Stories had been shared. Laughter had quietly mixed with tears. Every person in the room understood that careers eventually ended, but character remained behind in the lives people touched. Vanessa whispered a few words of thanks beneath her breath before turning off the hallway light. In the kitchen, she heated a bowl of homemade vegetable soup left over from the previous weekend, then stood beside the window watching gentle rain begin to fall across the empty street. Her phone vibrated once with a message from an old academy friend asking whether she had arrived home safely. Vanessa smiled as she typed a short reply. Yes, finally home. Get some sleep. Tomorrow will come early. After washing the dishes, she walked through each room as she always did before bed, checking that every window was locked and every light except the porch lamp had been turned off. Habit had become second nature after years spent investigating people who rarely respected ordinary boundaries. Yet despite everything she had witnessed throughout her career, she had refused to let suspicion become the lens through which she viewed every stranger. She believed caution and compassion could exist together if people chose them carefully. Before going upstairs, she stopped in front of a small wooden table where a framed photograph of her mother rested beside fresh white lilies. "Good night," she whispered softly, smiling the same gentle smile she had carried since childhood. Upstairs, she changed into comfortable clothes, placed a novel on the bedside table, and read only a few pages before sleep slowly overtook the fatigue she had ignored for weeks. Outside, the neighborhood remained peaceful beneath the soft rhythm of falling rain. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement, while distant freight trains echoed somewhere beyond the city limits. Nothing suggested that before dawn the calm she had spent years building would be interrupted by people who believed they already knew exactly who lived behind her front door. Vanessa kept both hands visible exactly where the officers could see them, her breathing slow and measured despite the bright beams of several flashlights moving across the walls of her home. She understood procedure well enough to know that sudden movements could easily be misunderstood, especially during a high-risk operation carried out in the middle of the night. Looking directly at Officer Ryan Mitchell, she spoke with quiet confidence. "Officer, I am not going anywhere. Please take a moment and verify the address before this goes any further." Ryan remained focused, although something about her calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. He had encountered frightened homeowners, angry residents, and people determined to argue with every instruction. Vanessa did none of those things. She simply stood still, watching each officer with the same careful attention they were giving her. "Ma'am," Ryan replied evenly, "we have information that an armed suspect entered this residence. Until we confirm everyone inside is safe, we have to continue clearing the house." Vanessa slowly nodded. "Then I sincerely hope you complete that process safely." Her answer felt strangely reassuring rather than defensive. Behind Ryan, another officer carefully examined the dining room while a second walked toward the hallway leading to the study. Every cabinet, doorway, and corner was illuminated one by one. The house revealed nothing except remarkable order. Books sat neatly arranged on polished wooden shelves. Framed family photographs lined the walls. A folded American flag rested inside a glass display case above the fireplace. There were no signs of panic, forced entry, or anyone attempting to hide. Ryan quietly noticed how meticulously everything had been maintained. Even at 2 o'clock in the morning, the home reflected discipline rather than disorder. Sergeant David Lawson stepped into the living room after receiving updates from officers checking the rear of the property. "Nothing outside," one officer reported through the radio. "Windows secure. No evidence anyone entered from the backyard." Lawson acknowledged the message before turning toward Ryan. "Status." Ryan answered without taking his eyes off Vanessa. "Resident located. Cooperative. Continuing interior verification." Lawson gave a brief nod. "Finish clearing every room." Vanessa listened without interruption. After several long seconds, she spoke again. "There is no one else inside the house." Ryan met her eyes. "We still need to verify that ourselves." "I understand," she answered gently. "That is exactly what I would expect professionals to do." The statement caught Ryan by surprise. Instead of criticizing the officers, she had complimented their responsibility. The unexpected response created a moment of hesitation that lingered beneath the steady rhythm of police radios and quiet footsteps echoing from the hallway. Meanwhile, one younger officer entered a small home office filled with organized case files, legal reference books, and shelves containing criminal justice publications. He paused briefly, noticing that every item appeared carefully labeled and meticulously maintained. Nothing suggested the hurried lifestyle of someone fleeing from law enforcement. Returning toward the hallway, he glanced into another room where framed certificates decorated one wall beside photographs of graduation ceremonies and community events. He leaned slightly closer, trying to read one of the documents before continuing his search. In the living room, Ryan lowered his flashlight slightly, no longer pointing it directly toward Vanessa. "Do you live here alone?" he asked. "Yes," she answered. "Have you noticed anyone around your property tonight?" "No." "Any unusual sounds before we arrived?" Vanessa thought for a moment before shaking her head. "Only the rain earlier this evening." Her voice remained remarkably steady. Outside, the neighborhood had begun returning to silence. Porch lights still glowed softly across the street while curious neighbors continued watching discreetly through curtains, unable to understand what was unfolding inside the quiet brick home. Then, from the hallway, the younger officer suddenly stopped walking. His flashlight remained fixed on something mounted against the wall just beyond the study doorway. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. His expression shifted from routine concentration to unmistakable surprise. Slowly, almost instinctively, he stepped closer. Hanging neatly on a wooden wall hook was a dark blue field jacket with large yellow letters across the back that reflected brightly beneath the flashlight. Beside it rested a polished federal credentials display, a framed Quantico graduation photograph, and multiple commendations recognizing years of distinguished public service. The officer lowered his flashlight slightly, staring in complete silence before looking back toward Ryan, his voice no louder than a whisper. "Sir, I think you need to come see this." Ryan followed the younger officer down the hallway, each step slower than the last as an unfamiliar feeling settled over him. The beam from his flashlight landed on the dark blue jacket hanging neatly against the wall, and for a brief moment, he simply stared without saying a word. Large yellow letters across the back reflected brightly beneath the light. FBI. Beside the jacket hung a framed identification photograph from Quantico, several commendations recognizing years of federal service, and a collection of challenge coins displayed inside a polished wooden case. Nothing appeared decorative or exaggerated. Everything reflected a career built through discipline, sacrifice, and public service. The younger officer quietly lowered his flashlight. "Sir," he whispered, "this does not look like the house we were expecting." Ryan stepped closer, studying each item carefully. The graduation photograph showed a younger Vanessa standing proudly among fellow Academy graduates. Another frame contained a formal recognition signed by senior Department of Justice officials. A third displayed a photograph of Vanessa speaking to a group of young students during a community outreach program while wearing the same field jacket, now hanging silently before them. Ryan felt his certainty begin to dissolve. Back in the living room, Sergeant David Lawson noticed the unusual silence coming from the hallway. "Ryan," he called. There was no immediate answer. Lawson walked toward the study and stopped the instant he saw what the officers were looking at. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with concern. Years of command experience had taught him that moments like this required calm rather than excuses. He slowly looked from the jacket to the framed credentials and then toward Ryan. "Have dispatch verify everything," he said quietly. Ryan immediately reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. His voice remained professional, but the confidence heard only minutes earlier had noticeably faded. "Dispatch, Unit 12 requesting immediate address confirmation and full update on the suspect location." Static filled the air for several long seconds before the dispatcher acknowledged the request. While they waited, the house seemed unusually still. The flashlights that had moments earlier swept rapidly across every room now rested quietly at officers' sides. Vanessa remained exactly where she had been standing, hands still visible, watching without satisfaction or resentment. She understood what they had discovered long before anyone spoke. She also understood that embarrassment often arrived before understanding. Ryan returned to the living room and looked at her differently for the first time that night. He noticed details he had overlooked when he believed he already knew the story. The framed military photograph of her father. Shelves filled with criminal law reference books. Community service awards displayed beside family pictures instead of expensive decorations. Every corner of the home reflected years spent protecting others rather than hiding from them. Vanessa spoke softly, careful not to embarrass anyone. "Officer, may I lower my hands now?" Ryan hesitated only a moment before answering. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." She slowly lowered them and gently folded them together in front of her. No frustration appeared on her face, only quiet patience. The dispatcher finally returned over the radio. "Unit 12, stand by for correction. We are reviewing updated information from responding officers." Ryan closed his eyes briefly as those words settled heavily in his mind. A correction. Lawson remained composed, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Another transmission followed only seconds later. "Unit 12, be advised, responding detectives have identified a possible address discrepancy. Confirm your current location." Ryan read the house number displayed beside the front entrance. The dispatcher paused. Then came the sentence none of the officers expected to hear. "Unit 12, the suspect was last seen entering 1428 Maple Ridge Drive. Your current location is 1482 Maple Ridge Drive." Silence filled the house more completely than any spoken apology could have. Ryan slowly looked toward the front window where the neighboring houses stretched quietly beneath the dim streetlights. Only 54 numbers separated the two addresses, yet those few digits had changed the course of the entire night. He turned back toward Vanessa, searching for words that suddenly felt far more difficult than any tactical decision he had made only minutes before. Before he could speak, Vanessa simply offered a calm, understanding smile that somehow carried more weight than anger ever could. The dispatcher repeated the corrected address one final time before the radio fell silent again, leaving only the faint hum of police equipment and the quiet ticking of an old grandfather clock standing in the corner of the living room. No one moved. The bright beams of several Flashlights that had moments earlier searched every corner of the house now rested harmlessly against the hardwood floor, their lights softened by polished furniture and family photographs. Officer Ryan Mitchell felt the weight of the silence far more deeply than the weight of the equipment attached to his uniform. Throughout his career, he had been taught that decisive action saved lives, yet no training manual had ever fully prepared him for the moment when certainty gave way to undeniable truth. Sergeant David Lawson slowly removed his patrol cap and held it at his side. His expression remained calm, but years of leadership had taught him to recognize the difference between an unavoidable emergency and a preventable mistake. He looked around the room with new eyes. The framed military flag above the fireplace, the carefully organized shelves of criminal law textbooks, community awards displayed beside family photographs instead of expensive decorations. Every detail reflected a life devoted to public service, and somehow those quiet objects spoke more loudly than any explanation ever could. Vanessa Coleman noticed the change immediately. The tension that had filled the room only minutes earlier had begun to dissolve into thoughtful reflection. She quietly walked toward the kitchen without sudden movement and paused before looking back at the officers. "Would anyone like some coffee?" she asked gently. The question surprised every person in the room. Ryan blinked in disbelief. "Ma'am," he answered quietly. "After everything that has happened, you are offering us coffee?" Vanessa gave a small smile that reached her eyes. "It is almost 2:30 in the morning. It has been a long night for everyone." No one answered for several seconds. Finally, Sergeant Lawson nodded respectfully. "Thank you, but we do not deserve your hospitality tonight." Vanessa did not argue. She simply filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove anyway. The familiar sound of running water somehow restored a sense of ordinary life that had vanished when the officers first entered the house. Outside, light rain had begun falling again, tapping softly against the windows while porch. Lights reflected across the wet pavement. Ryan slowly walked toward the hallway where the FBI jacket still hung exactly where it had been hours earlier. He studied it more carefully now. It was not the jacket itself that affected him. It was what it represented. Years spent protecting communities. Investigations completed without recognition. Sacrifices invisible to strangers. He realized that before seeing those yellow letters, he had unconsciously built an entire story about the woman standing before him without knowing a single meaningful fact about her life. Vanessa returned carrying several ceramic mugs, placing them quietly on the dining table before sitting down herself. "Officer Mitchell," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" Ryan looked up. "Yes, ma'am. When dispatch gave you the address tonight, did you believe you were protecting someone?" He answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Then your intention was honorable." Ryan lowered his eyes. "Intentions matter, but so do consequences." Vanessa nodded thoughtfully. "That is true." She wrapped both hands around the warm mug without taking a sip. "In my line of work, I learned a long time ago that fear often arrives before facts. The difficult part is making sure facts eventually catch up." Her words carried no accusation, only experience. Lawson quietly listened from across the room, recognizing the wisdom that comes only after decades of difficult decisions. Another officer gently placed a picture frame upright after accidentally shifting it during the search. He took a small step backward, almost as if restoring the photograph somehow restored a measure of respect to the home itself. Ryan finally met Vanessa's eyes again. "I should have listened when you asked us to verify the address." She answered with remarkable calm. "You listened eventually. Some people never do." The kettle began to whistle softly, filling the room with a warm, familiar sound that contrasted sharply with the cold urgency of only minutes before. Rain continued falling outside, while the first faint hint of dawn remained hours away. In that quiet living room, surrounded by photographs, books, and memories that had never deserved suspicion, every person present understood that the greatest mistake of the night had not been made by one individual alone. It had been created by assumptions moving just a little faster than careful verification, and that lesson would remain with them long after the darkness outside finally gave way to morning. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee slowly replaced the sharp scent of damp uniforms and rain that had followed the officers into the house. No one seemed eager to leave the dining room, even though the urgent radio traffic outside had already shifted toward the correct address several blocks away. Officer Ryan Mitchell held the ceramic mug carefully between both hands without taking a drink. The heat rising from the cup contrasted with the quiet discomfort that had settled inside him. Across the table, Vanessa Coleman sat with the calm posture of someone who had spent years guiding difficult conversations without allowing emotions to overpower judgment. She watched the rain slide gently down the kitchen window before speaking again. "Do you know what surprised me the most tonight?" she asked softly. Ryan looked up. "No, ma'am. Not that officers came into my home." She paused briefly. "That happens sometimes when information goes wrong. What surprised me was how quickly everyone decided they already understood the person who lived here. The words were spoken without bitterness, yet every officer in the room felt their weight." Sergeant David Lawson rested his elbows lightly on the table and nodded almost imperceptibly. "That is a fair observation," he admitted. "We allowed urgency to narrow our perspective." Vanessa smiled politely. "Urgency is real. I have lived with it for most of my career. But urgency should never replace verification." Ryan quietly looked around the room once more. The photographs no longer appeared to him as ordinary decorations. One showed Vanessa receiving a community service award from local children. Another captured her standing beside firefighters, police officers, and emergency medical personnel during a disaster relief event years earlier. A third displayed her shaking hands with graduates at Quantico. He realized that every image represented years of work devoted to protecting people, including communities that would never know her name. One of the younger officers slowly stood and walked toward the hallway before returning with the dark blue FBI field jacket folded neatly across his arms. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "I did not want to leave this hanging where our equipment nearly brushed against it." Vanessa accepted the jacket with gentle care, smoothing one sleeve with her fingertips before placing it across the back of a nearby chair. "Thank you," she replied. "It belonged to a team much larger than me." Ryan noticed that she never referred to herself with pride or authority. Every answer emphasized service instead of status. That realization unsettled him even more than discovering who she was. His radio crackled softly once again. Dispatch confirmed that detectives had successfully located the robbery suspect at the correct residence without injuries and that the situation had been safely resolved. Ryan acknowledged the update before setting the radio back against his shoulder. The correct house had been only a short distance away all along. He drew a slow breath and finally said the words he had been struggling to find. "Mrs. Coleman, I owe you an apology that cannot be measured by procedure or paperwork. I believe the information we received, but I also recognize that I stopped asking questions once I believed I had the answer." Vanessa looked at him with quiet understanding. "Officer Mitchell, confidence is necessary in your profession. The challenge is remembering that confidence and certainty are not the same thing." Sergeant Lawson removed a small notebook from his uniform pocket and wrote down only a single sentence before closing it again. Ryan noticed the movement. "What did you write, Sergeant?" Lawson answered without hesitation. "Verify before you conclude." He looked around the table. "That sentence belongs in every briefing room we have." A faint smile appeared on Vanessa's face. "Then perhaps tonight we'll accomplish something meaningful after all." Outside, the rain had almost stopped. The first pale hint of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon beyond the quiet neighborhood, turning the black sky into deep shades of blue. Through the front window, the flashing lights from patrol vehicles gradually disappeared as officers cleared the scene one by one. Inside the small brick home, silence no longer carried tension. It carried reflection. Ryan understood that long after reports were filed and equipment returned to lockers, he would remember not the mistaken address or the federal jacket hanging on the wall, but the remarkable grace of the woman who had every reason to answer humiliation with anger and instead chose to teach a lesson no academy could ever fully explain. The first rays of morning sunlight slowly filtered through the rain-speckled kitchen window, washing the room in a soft golden glow that felt completely different from the harsh beams of flashlights that had filled the house only an hour earlier. Outside, patrol vehicles quietly departed one by one, their engines fading into the distance until the neighborhood returned to the peaceful silence it had known before the long night began. Sergeant David Lawson stood near the front door with his patrol cap in his hands, taking one final look around the home before turning toward Vanessa Coleman. "Mrs. Coleman, he said with quiet sincerity. There will be an official review of everything that happened tonight. That review cannot erase what you experienced, but it will make certain we understand exactly how this mistake occurred. Vanessa nodded gently. That is all I would hope for. Mistakes should become lessons before they become habits. Lawson extended his hand. Thank you for treating us with more grace than we deserved. Vanessa accepted the handshake with a calm smile. Grace is easiest to offer when people are willing to learn. Ryan Mitchell remained standing beside the dining table, still holding the coffee mug that had long since grown cool. Throughout the entire conversation, one question continued returning to his mind. Finally, he spoke. May I ask you something personal? Vanessa looked at him. Of course. Ryan hesitated for a moment. After everything you have seen during your career, after tonight, how do you continue? Trusting people? Vanessa quietly walked toward the hallway where the dark blue FBI jacket rested across the chair. She lifted it carefully, running her hand across the familiar fabric before placing it back on the wall hook where it had always belonged. Only then did she answer. Because if I allow one painful experience to decide how I see everyone else, then I become exactly what I spent my career trying to prevent. The room fell silent once again. Even the younger officers who had already begun gathering equipment stopped moving as they listened. Vanessa continued with the same calm voice. Every investigation I ever worked began with evidence, not assumptions. Every interview began with listening, not conclusions. That standard should not disappear simply because the hour is late or the situation feels urgent. Ryan lowered his eyes. Those words reached him more deeply than any disciplinary action ever could. He realized that the greatest lesson of the night had not come from discovering an FBI jacket or correcting an address. It had come from watching someone choose dignity over resentment when resentment would have been much easier. Lawson glanced toward Ryan before speaking. Officer Mitchell, I want you to remain after shift briefing this afternoon. Ryan nodded immediately. Yes, Sergeant. Lawson looked back toward Vanessa. I would like to invite you to speak with our department if you are willing. Not as a federal agent. As the person who taught us something none of our manuals explained. Vanessa appeared genuinely surprised. You believe your officers would listen? Lawson smiled faintly. After tonight, I think they will. A few minutes later, the officers carefully checked every room one final time, not searching for danger now, but making certain every chair, picture frame, and personal belonging had been returned exactly as they found it. One young officer gently straightened a family photograph that had shifted slightly during the search. Another quietly closed a cabinet door left open in the kitchen. Small gestures, perhaps, yet each reflected a sincere desire to leave the home with the same respect that should have accompanied their arrival. Ryan paused at the doorway before stepping outside. He turned back one final time. Morning sunlight now illuminated the hallway where the FBI jacket hung beside photographs of family, service, and community. Hours earlier, he had seen only a possible crime scene. Now he saw the home of a woman whose life had been dedicated to protecting strangers she might never meet. Mrs. Coleman, he said softly, I promise you this night will change the way I wear this badge. Vanessa answered with the same gentle smile she had carried since the moment she first stepped into the hallway with empty hands. Then perhaps this night was not wasted after all. Ryan stepped onto the front porch as cool morning air carried the scent of fresh rain across the quiet neighborhood. Behind him, the front door closed gently, not with anger, not with fear, but with the quiet confidence that truth, patience, and character had spoken more powerfully than authority ever could. 6 months later, autumn arrived in Richmond with crisp morning air and maple leaves drifting quietly across the sidewalks outside the Richmond Police Training Academy. The building looked no different than it had for years, yet inside one classroom something had changed in a way no renovation could ever accomplish. Rows of new police recruits sat beside experienced officers attending advanced professional development. At the front of the room, a simple projector displayed only 5 words across a white screen. Verify before you conclude. There were no dramatic graphics, no slogans, and no speeches prepared to impress anyone. Officer Ryan Mitchell sat in the front row wearing his neatly pressed uniform, a notebook already opened before the presentation even began. Since that unforgettable night, he had become known throughout the department for asking one additional question before making difficult decisions. Younger officers occasionally teased him for double-checking every address, every report, and every dispatch note. Ryan never minded. He simply smiled because he understood the cost of believing certainty too quickly. Sergeant David Lawson entered the room and welcomed everyone with only a few brief remarks. Before introducing the morning's guest speaker, Vanessa Coleman walked calmly to the front of the classroom wearing a dark business suit instead of her field jacket. She carried no notes. She did not mention her position or the year she had served. She simply looked around the room at every face before speaking. "Every badge in this room represents trust," she said quietly. "The public will often remember how you made them feel long after they forget what you said." The classroom became completely silent. Vanessa did not recount the details of that night. She never mentioned the mistaken address or the embarrassment that followed. Instead, she shared stories from years of investigations, explaining how patients had uncovered truths that urgency alone would have missed. She described witnesses who had been misunderstood because they appeared nervous, families who had been unfairly judged because of assumptions, and investigations solved only after someone took the time to listen instead of rushing toward conclusions. Every lesson pointed toward the same principle. Facts deserve the chance to arrive before judgment. Ryan listened more carefully than he had ever listened during academy training. He realized that leadership was not measured only by decisive action. It was also measured by the discipline to pause when circumstances demanded another look. At the end of the presentation, one young recruit raised a hand. "Ma'am," he asked respectfully, "after everything you have experienced, what is the most important quality a good officer should have?" Vanessa smiled gently before answering. "Humility. Because humility leaves room for truth to enter after confidence has already spoken." The room remained quiet long after she finished the sentence. No one hurried toward the exit when the session ended. Officers gathered in small conversations, reflecting on what they had heard rather than simply collecting training materials. Ryan waited until the classroom had nearly emptied before walking toward Vanessa. He extended his hand with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for accepting the invitation." Vanessa returned the handshake warmly. "Thank you for proving that people can grow." Ryan smiled. "I keep thinking about something you told me that morning." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Which part?" "You said confidence and certainty are not the same thing." Vanessa nodded. "I still believe that." Ryan closed his notebook and looked toward the rows of empty chairs where future officers would soon sit. "Now I teach it to every new partner assigned to my patrol car." Through the tall academy windows, golden afternoon sunlight stretched across the parking lot, where patrol vehicles stood quietly beneath trees glowing with shades of amber and crimson. A gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the pavement before lifting them into the air for only a moment. Vanessa paused near the academy entrance and looked back once more. Ryan stood speaking with a group of younger officers, listening carefully before answering their questions. She recognized something she valued more than any commendation hanging on her wall at home. She saw a lesson becoming a legacy. Without another word, she walked toward her car beneath the warm autumn light while the academy doors closed softly behind her. Inside, another class had begun learning that real strength is not found in never making mistakes, but in having the courage to recognize them, learn from them, and choose dignity over assumption every single time.